Matthew Hopkins was an English witch hunter whose career flourished during the English Civil War. He claimed to hold the office of Witchfinder General, although that title was never bestowed by Parliament. His witch hunts mainly took place in East Anglia. Hopkins's witch-finding career began in March 1644 and lasted until his retirement in 1647. He and his associates were responsible for more people being hanged for witchcraft than in the previous 100 years, and were solely responsible for the increase in witch trials during those years. He is believed to have been responsible for the deaths of 300 women between the years 1644 and 1646. It has been estimated that all of the English witch trials between the early 15th and late 18th centuries resulted in fewer than 500 executions for witchcraft. Therefore, presuming the number executed as a result of investigations by Hopkins and his colleague John Stern is at the lower end of the various estimates, their efforts accounted for about 60% of the total. In the 14 months of the Crusade, Hopkins and Stern sent to the gallows more people than all the other witch hunters in England of the previous 160 years. Early life. Very little is known of Matthew Hopkins before 1644, and there are no surviving contemporary documents concerning him or his family. He was born in Great Wenham, Suffolk, and was the fourth son of 6 children. His father, James Hopkins, was a Puritan clergyman and vicar of St. John's of Great Wenham in Suffolk. The family at one point held title to lands and tenements in Framlingham at the castle. His father was popular with his parishioners, one of whom in 1619 left money to purchase Bibles for his then 3 children, James, John and Thomas. Thus Matthew Hopkins could not have been born before 1619, and could not have been older than 28 when he died, but he may have been as young as 25. Although James Hopkins had died in 1634, when William Dowsing, commissioned in 1643 by the parliamentarians in Manchester for the destruction of monuments of idolatry and superstition, visited the parish in 1645, he noted that there was nothing to reform. Hopkins's brother John became minister of South Fambridge in 1645 but was removed from the post 1 year later for neglecting his work. Hopkins states in his book The Discovery of Witches that he never travelled far to gain his experience. In the early 1640s, Hopkins moved to Manningtree, Essex, a town on the River Stour, about 10 miles from Wenham. According to tradition, Hopkins used his recently acquired inheritance of 100 marks to establish himself as a gentleman and to buy the Thorn Inn in Mistley. For the way that he presented evidence in trials, Hopkins is commonly thought to have been trained as a lawyer, but there is scant evidence to suggest this was the case. Witch hunting. Following the Lancaster witch trial of 1634, William Harvey, physician to King Charles I of England, had been ordered to examine the 4 women accused, and from this there came a requirement to have material proof of being a witch. The work of Hopkins and John Stern was not necessarily to prove any of the accused had committed acts of maleficium, but the fact they had made a covenant with the devil. Prior to this point, any malicious acts on the part of witches were treated identically to those of other criminals, until it was seen that they owed the powers to a deliberate act of their choosing. Witches then became heretics to Christianity, which became the greatest of the crimes and sins. Within continental and Roman law, witchcraft was crimen acceptum, a crime so foul that all normal legal procedures were superseded. Because the devil was not going to confess, it was necessarily to gain a confession from the human involved. The witch hunts undertaken by Stern and Hopkins mainly took place in East Anglia, in the counties of Suffolk, Essex, Norfolk, Cambridgeshire and Huntingdonshire, and also beyond East Anglia in the counties of Northamptonshire and Bedfordshire. They extended throughout the area of strongest Puritan and parliamentarian influences which formed the powerful and influential Eastern Association. From 1644 to 1647, centred on Essex. Both Hopkins and Sterne would have required some form of letters of safe conduct to be able to travel throughout the counties. According to his book The Discovery of Witches, Hopkins began his career as a witch-finder after he overheard various women discussing the meetings with the devil in March 1644 in Manningtree. In fact, the first accusations were made by Sterne, and Hopkins was appointed as his assistant. 23 women were accused of witchcraft, tried at Chelmsford in 1645. With the English Civil War underway, this trial was conducted not by justices of assize but by justices of the peace presided over by the Earl of Warwick. 4 died in prison and 19 were convicted and hanged. During this period, excepting Middlesex and chartered towns, no records show any person charged of witchcraft being sentenced to death other than by the judges of the assizes. Hopkins and Sterne, accompanied by the women who performed the pricking, were soon travelling over eastern England, claiming to be officially commissioned by Parliament to uncover and prosecute witches. Together with the female assistants, they were well paid for the work, and it has been suggested that this was a motivation for his actions. Hopkins states that his fees were to maintain his company with 3 horses, and that he took 20 shillings a town. The records at Stowmarket show their costs to the town to have been £23 plus his travelling expenses. The cost to the local community of Hopkins and his company were such that, in 1645, a special local tax rate had to be levied in Ipswich. Parliament was well aware of Hopkins and his team's activities, as shown by the concerned reports of the Bury St Edmunds witch trials of 1645. Before the trial, a report was carried to the Parliament as if some busy men had made use of some arts to extort such confession. That of Special Commission of Oyer and Terminer was granted for the trial of these witches. After the trial and execution, the Moderate Intelligencer, a parliamentary paper published during the English Civil War, in an editorial of 4 to 11 September 1645, expressed unease with the affairs in Bury. Methods of investigation. Although torture was unlawful in England, Hopkins often used techniques such as sleep deprivation to extract confessions from his victims. He would also cut the arm of the accused with a blunt knife, and if she did not bleed, she was said to be a witch. Another of his methods was the swimming test, based on the idea that as witches had renounced their baptism, water would reject them. Suspects were tied to a chair and thrown into water. All those who swam were considered to be witches. Hopkins was warned against the use of swimming without receiving the victim's permission first. This led to the legal abandonment of the test by the end of 1645. Hopkins and his assistants also looked for the devil's mark. This was a mark that all witches or sorcerers were supposed to possess that was said to be dead to all feeling and would not bleed, although in reality it was usually a mole, birthmark or an extra nipple or breast. If the suspected witch had no such visible marks, invisible ones could be discovered by pricking. Therefore employed witch prickers pricked the accused with knives and special needles, looking for such marks. Normally after the suspect had been shaved of all body hair. It was believed that the witch's familiar, an animal such as a cat or dog, would drink the witch's blood from the mark, as a baby drinks milk from the nipple. Opposition. Hopkins and his company ran into opposition very soon after the start of the work, but one of his main antagonists was John Gall, vicar of Great Staughton. Gall had attended a woman from St Neots who was held in jail charged with witchcraft until such time as Hopkins could attend. Upon hearing that the woman had been interviewed, Hopkins wrote a letter to a contact asking whether he would be given a good welcome. Gall, hearing of this letter, wrote his publication Select Cases of Conscience-Touching Witches and Witchcrafts, London, dedicated to Colonel Walton of the House of Commons, and began a programme of Sunday sermons to suppress witch-hunting. In Norfolk, both Hopkins and Stern were questioned by justices of the assizes about the torturing and fees. Hopkins was asked if methods of investigation did not make the finders themselves witches, and if with all his knowledge did he not also have a secret, or had used, unlawful courses of torture. By the time this court session resumed in 1647, Stern and Hopkins had retired, Hopkins to Manningtree and Stern to Bury St Edmunds. Colonial Impact. Hopkins's witch-hunting methods were outlined in his book The Discovery of Witches, which was published in 1647. These practices were recommended in law books. During the year following the publication of Hopkins's book, trials and executions for witchcraft began in the New England colonies, with the hanging of A.L.S.E. Young of Windsor, Connecticut on May 26, 1647, followed by the conviction of Margaret Jones, as described in the Journal of Governor John Winthrop. The evidence assembled against Margaret Jones was gathered by the use of Hopkins's techniques of searching and watching. Jones' execution was the first in a witch hunt that lasted in New England from 1648 until 1663. About 80 people throughout New England were accused of practicing witchcraft during that period, of whom 15 women and 2 men were executed. Some of Hopkins's methods were once again employed during the Salem witch trials, which occurred primarily in Salem, Massachusetts, in 1692–93. These trials resulted in 19 executions for witchcraft, 1 man, Giles Corey, pressed to death for refusing to plead, and 150 imprisonments. Death and legacy. Matthew Hopkins died at his home in Manningtree, Essex, on the 12th of August 1647, probably of pleural tuberculosis. He was buried a few hours after his death in the graveyard of the Church of St Mary at Mistley Heath. In the words of historian Malcolm Gaskell, Matthew Hopkins lives on as an anti-hero and bogeyman, utterly ethereal, endlessly malleable. According to historian Russell Hope Robbins, Hopkins acquired an evil reputation which in later days made his name synonymous with fingerman or informer paid by authorities to commit perjury. What historian James Sharp has characterized as a pleasing legend grew up around the circumstances of Hopkins's death, according to which he was subjected to his own swimming test and executed as a witch, but the parish registry at Mistley confirms his burial there.